March 15th, 1815. The grey light of late afternoon filtered through worn curtains that had once been fine blue damask, but now hung limp and faded like everything else in the Ashford household. Eleanor sat at the ancient pianoforte, her fingers moving across yellowed keys that produced notes slightly sharp or flat depending on their mood, the instrument as tired as the house itself, as weary as the young woman who played it. At 26, Eleanor had long since reconciled herself to her fate, spinster daughter to a ruined baron, her days measured in doses of laudanum for her father's pain and careful stitches to mend clothing that should have been replaced years ago. The piece she played was Melancholy, a sonata her mother had taught her before the fever took her, before father's gambling debts stripped them of everything but this crumbling country house and their bitter memories. Through the music she could almost forget the draughts that crept through every crack, the persistent damp that made her father's cough worse each winter, the way the villagers looked at her with that particular mixture of pity and satisfaction that came from witnessing a great family's fall. The Ashfords had once been prosperous, respected, until the Ravenscrofts had destroyed them with a manufactured land dispute that had broken her grandfather's heart and fortune alike. She struck a discordant note as the post arrived, unusual for this late in the day, and Mrs. Henley's shuffling footsteps approached the music room. The elderly housekeeper's face bore an expression of barely contained excitement as she held out a letter, expensive paper with an elegant seal. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately as that of Lady Harriet Beaumont, her only friend from her brief season 8 years ago, before their circumstances had made it impossible to maintain the facade of gentility in London. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal and read Harriet's warm words, inviting her to London for the season, offering sponsorship, gowns, everything needed to re-enter society. For a moment Eleanor's heart soared with impossible hope before crashing back to earth. She could never leave father, could never abandon her duty, could never face those who remembered what the Ashfords had been and delighted in what they had become. Setting the letter aside, she returned to her music. But her concentration was shattered when her father's bell rang insistently from his chamber. She found him propped against his pillows, face gaunt, but eyes sharp with the intelligence that had never dimmed despite his physical decline. He gestured to the letter in her hand with a bitter smile, somehow knowing its contents without reading them, and his voice was rough when he spoke of London, of the season, of the Ravenscrofts who would surely be there, the Duke of Thornhill himself holding court while Ashfords withered in exile. The coughing fit that followed his pronouncement left flecks of blood on his handkerchief, and Eleanor felt the familiar rise of helpless anger at their situation, at the unfairness of it all, at the enemy duke who lived in splendor while her father died by degrees in this tomb of former glory. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. April 5th, 1815. The bright spring sunshine of London seemed almost violent after the perpetual grey of the country, and Eleanor pressed herself back against the worn squabs of the hired carriage as it rattled through streets more crowded than she remembered from her brief season 8 years ago. Everything moved faster here, from the fashionable phaetons that swept past to the calls of flower sellers and the purposeful stride of gentlemen heading to their clubs, and she felt acutely aware of her outdated travelling dress and the modest trunk strapped to the back that contained the entirety of her wardrobe, sir. Harriet's townhouse on Brook Street stood elegant and welcoming with its freshly painted black door and window boxes already blooming with early pansies, a stark contrast to the peeling paint and broken shutters Eleanor had left behind. The butler who answered wore livery finer than anything Eleanor owned, but his smile was genuine as he welcomed her. And then Harriet herself appeared at the top of the stairs, descending in a rustle of rose silk with her arms outstretched and tears of joy sparkling in her eyes. The embrace that followed nearly undid Eleanor's carefully maintained composure, for here was warmth and acceptance after years of cold isolation. Here was someone who remembered her not as the disgraced baron's daughter, but simply as Eleanor. The morning room where Harriet led her blazed with light from tall windows overlooking a small but immaculate garden, and over tea served in delicate Sèvres cups that made Eleanor terrified to lift her hand lest she break something. Harriet spoke with infectious enthusiasm about the season's prospects and the invitations already arriving. It was when she mentioned securing Eleanor a coveted invitation to the Thornhill ball that Eleanor's cup rattled against its saucer, tea sloshing dangerously as the name of her family's enemy fell between them like a stone. The Duke of Thornhill's opening ball was the event that would set the tone for the entire season, Harriet explained with careful neutrality, watching Eleanor's face, and it would be the perfect opportunity to re-establish herself in society. Eleanor wanted to refuse, wanted to explain that she could never set foot in the home of the man whose family had destroyed hers, but Harriet's next words stopped her cold. The current Duke was expected to announce his engagement to Lady Sophia Montague at the ball. Everyone said so, and the beautiful daughter of the Marquis of Pembroke had been telling anyone who would listen that she would soon be Duchess of Thornhill. Eleanor found herself thinking of the enemy Duke she had never seen, this man who bore the name that had haunted her family's decline, wondering if he was as cold and cruel as his father had been, if he ever thought of the Ashfords he had helped ruin, if he would even know who she was if she dared appear at his ball. The thought of facing him, of walking into his domain with her head high despite everything, ignited something in Eleanor's chest that felt dangerously like defiance. April 6th, 1815. The modiste's shop on Bond Street hummed with the particular energy of feminine commerce, a world of silks and satins where fortunes could be made or lost on the cut of a sleeve, and Eleanor stood before the looking-glass feeling more exposed than if she'd been naked. Madame Beauregard circled her with pins between her teeth, muttering in French about the challenge of creating elegance from nothing, while Harriet supervised with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. The silver gown taking shape around Eleanor's body was a revelation, its modest neckline somehow more alluring than any plunging décolletage, the way it caught the light, transforming her ordinary brown hair into something that might generously be called burnished bronze. She tried not to think about the cost, tried not to calculate how many months of household expenses this single dress represented, but the numbers haunted her as surely as the whispers from the fitting room next door where Lady Sophia Montague held court. That crystalline voice carried through the silk curtains with perfect clarity, speaking of the Thornhill ball, of her certainty that the Duke would propose before the season's end, of the amusing little nobodies who thought to elevate themselves through strategic friendships. Eleanor's hands clenched involuntarily as she heard her own name mentioned, the poor Ashford girl brought as dear Lady Beaumont's charity project, and how tragic it was when good families forgot that certain associations could only lower one's standing. The cloying scent of roses that accompanied Lady Sophia seemed to seep through the curtain like poison, and Eleanor stood straighter, meeting her own gaze in the mirror with a defiance she didn't entirely feel. Harriet's hand found hers, squeezing gently in solidarity, and when Lady Sophia emerged from her fitting room in a confection of pink silk that probably cost more than the Ashford estate's annual income, Eleanor met her gaze steadily. The beauty's perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of false surprise and sympathy, commenting on how brave Eleanor was to attempt a return to society after such unfortunate family circumstances, and surely she must find London so changed after years of rural seclusion. The words dripped honey, but carried daggers, each syllable calculated to wound, to remind Eleanor of her place, of her family's fall, of the Duke of Thornhill, whose name Lady Sophia claimed with such confidence. But something sparked in Eleanor's chest, a flame of anger that had been banked for too long, and when she replied that she found London much the same, still full of people who confused circumstance with character, the shop fell silent. Madame Beauregard suddenly found urgent business in the back room, but Harriet's smile could have lit the entire street as Lady Sophia's perfect complexion flushed an unbecoming red. The moment passed, Lady Sophia sweeping out with her entourage. But Eleanor caught sight of herself in the mirror again and saw something different in her reflection, something that had nothing to do with the silver gown and everything to do with remembering that she was still an Ashford, and Ashfords did not bow to anyone, not even to those who would be duchesses. April 10th, 1815. The approach to Thornhill House through Mayfair's gas-lit streets felt like advancing on an enemy stronghold, and Eleanor gripped her mother's grey gloves with hands that trembled despite her best efforts at composure, while Harriet's carriage joined the queue of elegant vehicles discharging their glittering occupants at the grandest address in London. The massive Georgian facade blazed with light from every window, torches flanking the entrance where liveried footmen helped ladies in jewels worth more than the Ashford estate from their carriages, and above the great doorway, the Ravenscroft family crest seemed to mock her audacity in daring to enter. The silver gown caught the torchlight as she descended, transforming her into something almost ethereal. But Eleanor felt more like a moth drawn to flame, knowing she might be burned, but unable to resist the pull of proving to herself and to the ghosts of her family that she could face their enemy with dignity intact. The entrance hall soared 3 stories above her head, Italian marble and crystal competing for magnificence, while the sounds of music and laughter drifted from the ballroom beyond, and she forced herself to breathe steadily as Harriet's reassuring presence at her side guided her through receiving lines where names and titles blurred together until they reached the ballroom doors. The space beyond defied imagination, a golden cavern where 500 candles reflected off mirrors and gilt, where diamonds sparkled on throats and turbans, and the orchestra played from a gallery above like angels providing the soundtrack to paradise. And Eleanor stood frozen at the threshold, overwhelmed by the sheer aggressive display of wealth and power that seemed designed to remind lesser mortals of their place. Then the whispers began, rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat, as recognition dawned on faces both familiar and strange. The Ashford name carrying on lips with varying degrees of surprise and speculation and outright dismay that she would dare appear here of all places. She lifted her chin and stepped forward into the lion's den, feeling the weight of stares like physical touches, hearing her family name twisted into weapons of gossip. But Harriet's hand at her elbow anchored her as they moved along the ballroom's edge, where the wallflowers and chaperones held court. The dancing had not yet begun in earnest, couples promenading in the center while others clustered in conversation groups that fell silent as she passed, and Eleanor fixed her gaze on a point somewhere beyond the sea of faces, refusing to let them see how their judgment affected her even as her heart raced beneath the silver silk. It was then, as she paused near a potted palm to catch her breath and gather her courage, that she felt it, a prickling awareness that made her glance up toward the far end of the ballroom where a man stood apart from the crowd, his dark evening clothes severe against the bright plumage around him, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And even across the vast space she knew with absolute certainty that she was looking at Frederick Ravenscroft, the Duke of Thornhill, her family's enemy, watching her with eyes that seemed to see straight through her careful composure to the defiant heart beneath. The orchestra master's voice carried across the golden expanse as he announced the next dance. A waltz, that most scandalous of imports that still made matrons clutch their fans in dismay, and Eleanor pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the potted palm, resigned to her role as invisible observer when a ripple of movement through the crowd made her heart stutter to a stop. Frederick Ravenscroft moved through the ballroom with the inexorable purpose of a warship cutting through waves, his severe black evening clothes making him look like a figure carved from midnight itself. And Eleanor watched in growing alarm as he drew closer, those piercing blue eyes never wavering from her face, even as conversation died in his wake, like flowers touched by frost. She could not move, could not breathe, could only stand frozen as he halted before her with a precision that suggested military training. And when he extended one elegant hand toward her, the gesture carrying the weight of command despite its surface courtesy, she heard the collective intake of breath from those near enough to witness this impossibility. His voice, when he spoke, was deeper than she'd imagined, cultured tones that somehow made her name sound like music rather than the burden it had become, requesting the honor of this dance with a formality that did nothing to disguise the challenge blazing in his eyes, and Eleanor found herself placing her trembling hand in his before her mind could form a coherent reason to refuse. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea as he led her onto the dance floor, whispers rising like a tide behind them, and Eleanor felt the weight of 500 stares as he turned to face her, one hand settling at her waist with a touch that burned through the silver silk, while the other cradled her gloved fingers with unexpected gentleness. The music began, that sweeping three-quarter time that demanded surrender to its rhythm, and suddenly they were moving, his body guiding hers with an assurance that made resistance impossible, the heat of his palm at her waist making her achingly aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every point where the prescribed distance of the dance forced them apart. Neither spoke at first, circling each other in the patterns of the waltz like adversaries testing for weakness, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze even when the dance turned her away, could sense the controlled power in his movements that spoke of a man who never did anything without purpose, and when he finally broke the silence, his words were not what she expected. "You dance as though you've been trained for battle, Miss Ashford," he observed, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Every step defensive, every turn a retreat, though I wonder what enemy you think to find in a ballroom." The accusation stung because it was true, and Eleanor lifted her chin in defiance, even as he spun her through a turn that left her breathless, replying with a coolness she didn't feel that perhaps she had learned caution from those who had proven themselves enemies to her family, a dart that found its mark in the slight tightening of his jaw. "Ah," he said, and something flickered in those blue eyes that might have been regret, or possibly admiration. "Then allow me to surprise you, for I find myself uninterested in ancient feuds when faced with present fascination." The words made no sense, could make no sense coming from a Ravenscroft to an Ashford, yet the way he looked at her suggested he meant every syllable, and Eleanor felt her careful defenses wavering even as Lady Sophia's perfect face swam into view at the edge of the dance floor, her expression promising retribution. "You're causing a scandal," Eleanor managed to say, as he guided her through a particularly complex series of steps that brought them closer than propriety strictly allowed, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that made her think of forests after rain. "Good," he replied with a satisfaction that transformed his harsh features into something almost boyish. "I was beginning to bore myself with respectability, and you, Miss Ashford, are decidedly not boring." The compliment, if that's what it was, made her stumble slightly, but his hand at her waist steadied her instantly, and for a moment their eyes met with an intensity that made the rest of the ballroom fade away until there was nothing but the music and the magnetic pull between them that defied logic, history, and good sense. "Why?" she asked, the word escaping before she could stop it, carrying all her confusion and suspicion, and the unwilling attraction that frightened her more than his family name ever could. His expression shifted then, the mask of ducal arrogance slipping to reveal something raw and real beneath. And when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her believe him, despite every reason not to. "Because you're the first person in years to look at me as though I'm more than my title or my fortune, even if that look carries hatred. It's honest, and I find myself starving for honesty in a world that offers only pretty lies." The music was drawing to a close, the final notes hanging in the air like a question, and Eleanor realized with a start that she didn't want this dance to end, didn't want to return to the shadows where she belonged, didn't want to lose this strange, charged connection with the last man on earth she should feel anything for. But the waltz demanded its conclusion, and as he led her through the final turn, his hand lingering on hers a heartbeat longer than necessary, she felt the full weight of what had just occurred crashing over her like a wave. The scandal of it, the impossibility of it, the way her traitorous heart raced not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. The applause that marked the dance's end sounded like thunder in her ears, and without waiting for his bow, without meeting those penetrating blue eyes again, Eleanor turned and fled through the crowd, her silver skirts whispering across the marble as she sought escape from the magnitude of what had just passed between them. Even as she felt his gaze following her retreat like a physical touch that promised this was far from over. The garden doors beckoned like sanctuary, and Eleanor fled through them into the cool April night, her silver skirts catching on rose thorns as she stumbled down gravel paths until she found a stone bench hidden behind a wall of jasmine, whose heavy scent filled her lungs with sweetness that did nothing to calm the wild beating of her heart or the confusion raging through her mind like a storm. She sank onto the cold stone, her mother's grey gloves trembling as she pressed them to her burning cheeks, trying to make sense of what had just occurred, of the way Frederick Ravenscroft had looked at her, not with the cold disdain she expected from her family's enemy, but with an intensity that suggested she was something precious, something worth pursuing, which made no sense unless it was all an elaborate joke designed to humiliate the poor Ashford girl who dared enter his domain. The music from the ballroom drifted through the night air, another waltz beginning, and she closed her eyes against the memory of his hand at her waist, the controlled strength in his movements, the way his voice had wrapped around her name like velvet, but most of all the raw honesty in his eyes when he spoke of being starved for truth in a world of pretty lies. Footsteps on the gravel made her eyes fly open, and there he stood at the garden's entrance, a dark silhouette against the golden light spilling from the ballroom, and even in shadow she could see the tension in his shoulders. The way he hesitated, as though uncertain of his welcome, before moving toward her with that same deliberate purpose that had carried him across the ballroom to claim her for the dance. "You fled," he said simply when he stopped a proper distance from the bench, his voice carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been hurt beneath the ducal composure, and Eleanor found herself standing to face him, needing whatever small advantage height might give her against the overwhelming presence of him in the intimate darkness. "What game are you playing, Your Grace?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady, even as her heart raced, watching his face in the moonlight that turned his harsh features into something almost vulnerable. And when he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the muscle working in his jaw, she held her ground despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "No game," he said with a quietness that carried more weight than any shout, his blue eyes holding hers with that unnerving intensity. "Though I understand why you might think otherwise given our family's history, but I find myself caring very little for the sins of our fathers when faced with the reality of you, Eleanor Ashford, who looks at me as though I'm merely a man rather than a title or a bank vault or a prize to be won. The use of her first name without permission should have offended her, but instead it sent warmth spreading through her chest, dangerous warmth that threatened to melt the ice she'd packed around her heart for protection, and she turned away from him to stare at the jasmine blossoms glowing white in the darkness, asking the question that haunted her. Why would the Duke of Thornhill concern himself with someone like me when he could have anyone, when Lady Sophia waits inside ready to become his Duchess, when our very names are supposed to be at war? She heard him move closer, felt the warmth of him at her back, though he didn't touch her, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of confession that made her breath catch. Because I know what it is to be trapped by a name, by expectations, by the weight of history that we neither created nor wanted, and because when I saw you tonight, proud and defiant despite the whispers, refusing to let them diminish you, I recognized something in you that I've been searching for without knowing it existed. The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Eleanor turned to face him again, searching his face for any sign of mockery or deception, but finding only that raw honesty that frightened her more than any cruelty could have, and she heard herself saying words she hadn't planned. My father lies dying, broken by what your father did to us, drowning in debts that can never be repaid. And I came here tonight to prove to myself that I could face my enemy without flinching. But instead, you've left me more confused than I've ever been in my life. His face tightened with something that looked remarkably like pain, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. I know about your father's situation, no more than you might think, and I carry guilt for my family's actions that you cannot imagine. But tonight isn't about our fathers, or their feuds, or the past that binds us. Tonight is about the fact that when I held you in my arms during that waltz, for the first time in my life, something felt entirely right, and I find myself unwilling to let that feeling go simply because our names say we should be enemies. The confession hung in the air between them, dangerous and tempting as forbidden fruit, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, though she refused to let them fall, whispering the truth that terrified her. This is impossible. You must see that. Whatever this is between us, it cannot be. Not with our history, not with your position, not with the gulf that separates us in every possible way. Perhaps, he said, and suddenly he was standing directly before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in the blue depths. Close enough that when he raised one hand to hover near her cheek without quite touching, she felt the heat of it like a brand. But I've spent my entire life doing what's possible, what's expected, what's proper, and I find myself suddenly interested in exploring the impossible, especially if that impossibility has grey eyes that see too much, and a spirit that refuses to be broken despite every reason it should be. The garden around them seemed to hold its breath, the jasmine scent wrapping them in a cocoon of intimacy that made the ballroom and its judgments feel very far away, and Eleanor found herself swaying toward him slightly, drawn by a magnetism she didn't understand and couldn't resist, whispering his name like a question. Frederick? But before he could answer, before the moment could crystallize into something irreversible, Harriet's voice called from the garden door, worried and searching, and the spell shattered like glass, leaving them standing in the darkness with everything unresolved, everything unsaid, everything hanging in the balance of what might come next. And as Eleanor turned to go to her friend, Frederick caught her hand for just a moment, his touch burning through her mother's grey glove, his voice low and intense with promise. This isn't over, Eleanor Ashford. Not by half. The morning after the Thornhill ball dawned grey and drizzling, matching Eleanor's mood as she sat at Harriet's breakfast table, pushing eggs around her plate, while her friend read aloud from the gossip columns with barely suppressed glee. though the words made Eleanor's stomach churn with each delighted exclamation about how the Duke of Thornhill had shocked society by dancing with a certain enemy miss whose family circumstances are well known to be quite desperate, the columnist's pen dripping with poisonous speculation about what could have possessed his grace to show such marked attention to someone so far beneath his notice. By afternoon, the whispers had spread through every drawing-room in Mayfair like wildfire, and when Eleanor accompanied Harriet to Lady Pemberton's tea, she felt the weight of every stare, heard every hushed conversation that died as she passed, caught fragments of speculation that ranged from her having bewitched the Duke with dark arts to the more mundane suggestion that she had thrown herself at him in desperation, each theory more humiliating than the last. Lady Sophia Montague held court in the centre of the room, her perfect features arranged in an expression of sympathetic concern as she shared her worry for poor Miss Ashford, who clearly didn't understand that one dance given out of ducal politeness didn't constitute actual interest, her voice carrying just far enough to ensure Eleanor heard every cutting word while maintaining the pretense of discretion, and Eleanor forced herself to sip her tea with steady hands even as her cheeks burned with shame and anger. The next day brought no relief as the gossip columns seized upon the story with renewed vigour. One particularly vicious writer suggesting that the Ashford family's well-known financial difficulties made it clear what Miss Eleanor had been attempting with her desperate display at the Thornhill ball, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the steady rain that gave her excuse to refuse most invitations, though she couldn't escape the knowing looks from servants or the way conversations halted when she entered any room. On the third morning, a footman arrived at Harriet's door bearing an enormous arrangement of hothouse orchids, exotic blooms in deep purple and pristine white that must have cost a fortune, but the card bore no name, only a single line written in bold masculine script that read, "For the bravest woman in London." And Eleanor stared at the flowers with a mixture of longing and suspicion, wondering if this was Frederick's way of mocking her, or if perhaps, impossibly, he meant the sentiment behind the words. Harriet found her studying the orchids that evening, touching one velvet petal with a wistfulness Eleanor couldn't quite hide, and her friend's voice was gentle but firm as she observed that only one man in London would send such expensive flowers anonymously to a woman he'd danced with once, adding with characteristic insight that perhaps Eleanor should consider the possibility that the Duke's interest had been genuine rather than cruel, though Eleanor shook her head in automatic denial, even as her traitorous heart whispered that maybe, just maybe, Harriet was right about Frederick Ravenscroft's intentions, a hope she ruthlessly suppressed before it could take root and bloom into something that would only bring more pain when reality inevitably reasserted itself. The British Museum stood quiet and contemplative on this rainy April afternoon as Eleanor sought refuge among the ancient Greek sculptures, her worn blue pelisse still damp from the walk through drizzling streets, finding solace in the marble faces that asked nothing of her and whispered no gossip about desperate Ashford girls who danced above their station, though even here she couldn't entirely escape the weight of the past week's humiliation. The gallery skylights created a gentle percussion of raindrops that echoed through the vast space where she stood before a statue of Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, thinking how appropriate it was to seek strength from a deity who understood both intelligence and battle, when a familiar voice behind her quoted Keats with surprising softness. "Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know." And Eleanor's heart stuttered to recognize Frederick Ravenscroft standing there in the gallery's muted light, his ebony walking stick with its silver handle held loosely in one hand while rain darkened his shoulders. "Your Grace," she said, turning to face him with what dignity she could muster, while her pulse raced at this unexpected encounter that felt too convenient to be mere coincidence, watching as he approached with that same deliberate stride she remembered from the ballroom, but without the crowd of witnesses, without the weight of their audience, just two people among ancient stones and the sound of rain. "Miss Ashford?" he replied, stopping at a proper distance, though his blue eyes held that intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense. "I find myself drawn to the Greek collection on rainy afternoons when London society becomes particularly suffocating, though I confess I didn't expect to find Athena keeping such lovely company today." And despite herself, Eleanor felt warmth bloom at the compliment delivered without flourish or false charm. The goddess of wisdom rarely receives visitors who can quote Keats so readily, Eleanor heard herself reply, surprised by her own boldness in engaging him rather than fleeing. But something about the museum's hushed atmosphere and the way he looked at her like she was a masterpiece worth studying made her add, "Though I wonder if you agree with the poet that truth and beauty are truly all we need to know." Frederick's lips curved in what might have been his first genuine smile she'd witnessed, transforming his harsh features into something almost boyish as he moved to stand beside her before the statue, maintaining proper distance but close enough that she caught the scent of rain on wool and something else uniquely him. "I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew lately, particularly about the supposed truths society holds dear and the beauty it chooses to recognize or ignore." The weight of his words settled between them like an offering, and Eleanor found herself studying his profile as he gazed at Athena, seeing past the cold Duke persona to something more complex underneath, noting the way his jaw tightened slightly, as though he fought some internal battle before he continued. "Tell me, Miss Ashford, what draws you to the Greek collection specifically, beyond the obvious refuge it provides from wagging tongues and crude speculation?" "The honesty," Eleanor answered without hesitation, surprised by her own candor, but unable to dissemble when he seemed so genuinely interested in her thoughts, rather than her social standing or lack thereof. "These sculptures show humanity as it truly was to them, the divine and flawed combined, strength and vulnerability, carved into the same stone, unlike the perfect facades we're all expected to maintain, while our real selves suffocate beneath expectations and proprieties that serve no purpose but to divide us. You speak as one who understands the weight of facades intimately," Frederick observed, finally turning to look at her directly with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through every carefully constructed wall. And Eleanor felt exposed, but somehow not threatened by his scrutiny, as he added, "I confess I've spent so many years perfecting my own cold exterior that I sometimes wonder if there's anything genuine left beneath it, anything worth excavating from under the rubble of duty and expectation." The confession hung between them with surprising vulnerability, and Eleanor found herself responding to his honesty with her own. "Perhaps that's why we're both here among these ancient stones on a rainy afternoon, instead of performing our assigned roles in drawing rooms, where every word is measured for its social currency rather than its truth." And when he smiled again, softer this time, she felt something shift in her chest, like tectonic plates realigning. "Would you walk with me through the Egyptian collection?" Frederick asked with a formality that didn't match the warmth in his eyes, extending his arm in invitation. And after a moment's hesitation, Eleanor accepted, her hand settling on his sleeve as they moved deeper into the museum, while Lord George Sinclair watched from the Roman gallery with undisguised interest at his friend's unprecedented behavior with the Ashford girl. As they walked, Frederick spoke of hieroglyphics and their recent translation, revealing a depth of knowledge that surprised Eleanor, who had assumed his interests lay only in ledgers and land holdings, while she found herself sharing her own observations about the mathematical precision in pyramid construction, their conversation flowing with an ease that made the pretense of chance encounter increasingly transparent, especially when Frederick suggested they might happen to encounter each other again at the Royal Academy exhibition next Tuesday, weather permitting, of course, a suggestion Eleanor found herself accepting with a flutter of anticipation she couldn't quite suppress, despite every rational argument against hoping for anything more than these stolen moments of genuine connection in a world determined to keep them apart. The summons arrived at Harriet's townhouse on a rainy Tuesday morning, delivered by a liveried footman whose Ravenscroft colours made Eleanor's hand tremble as she accepted the cream-coloured card bearing the Dowager Duchess Agnes Ravenscroft's personal seal, an invitation to tea that afternoon at her private residence in Berkeley Square that felt more like a command than a request, leaving Eleanor staring at the elegant script, while Harriet insisted she must attend despite Eleanor's protests that she couldn't possibly face Frederick's grandmother after the scandal their waltz had created. The Dowager's sitting room proved to be a study in accumulated history, heavy velvet drapes filtering the grey afternoon light, while portraits of stern-faced Ravenscrofts gazed down from gilded frames, including one of a young boy with serious blue eyes that Eleanor recognized with a start as Frederick, before life had carved those harsh lines into his beautiful face, and she found herself studying it while waiting for the Dowager to appear, wondering what had transformed that solemn child into the cold Duke society knew. "He was 10 in that portrait," came a cultured voice from the doorway, and Eleanor turned to find the Dowager Duchess watching her with shrewd eyes that matched her grandson's in colour, if not in temperament, her silver hair arranged perfectly beneath a lace cap, while her posture remained regally straight despite her 70 years. "Painted just before his father began the systematic destruction of your family's fortune, though I suspect you've been taught a rather different version of events, Miss Ashford." Eleanor sank into a curtsy, her mind racing as she tried to understand why Frederick's grandmother had summoned her here to discuss the very feud that divided their families. But the Dowager waved her to a chair near the fire, where a silver tea service bearing the Ravenscroft crest waited on a mahogany table. "Your Grace, I'm not certain why you've asked me here," Eleanor managed, accepting the delicate china cup with hands she willed not to shake, while the Dowager's penetrating gaze seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance, from her modest afternoon dress to the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her obvious discomfort. "I've asked you here because my grandson danced with you," the Dowager replied with startling directness. "And Frederick has not danced with anyone in 5 years, not since that Montague chit tried to trap him into marriage with false rumours. So when he chose you, an Ashford of all people, for his first waltz in half a decade, I found myself curious about the woman who could make him forget his famous self-control." The Dowager set down her own cup with deliberate precision before continuing in a voice that carried the weight of long-held secrets. "Tell me, Miss Ashford, what do you know of how the feud between our families began, beyond the obvious fact that your grandfather lost his lands to mine in what your father doubtless described as theft?" When Eleanor carefully recited the story she'd heard countless times from her bitter father, how the old Duke had used legal trickery to steal the Ashford estates through a manufactured dispute over boundary lines, the Dowager's lips twisted in something between a smile and a grimace as she rose to retrieve a leather folder from her escritoire, extracting yellowed documents that she spread before Eleanor with deliberate care, pointing to specific passages that told a very different tale than the one Eleanor had always believed, revealing how her own grandfather had gambled away the estates in a drunken card game, and the old Duke had actually tried to return them before Eleanor's grandfather, in his pride and shame, had publicly accused the Ravenscrofts of cheating, forcing the Duke to keep the lands or admit to participating in illegal gaming. "But that's not the worst of it," the Dowager continued, her voice softening as she returned to the portrait of young Frederick. "My son inherited his father's cruel streak, but none of his honour. And when he became Duke, he took particular pleasure in grinding the Ashfords further into dust, buying up your father's debts, calling in loans at the worst possible moments, ensuring your family's complete ruin, not because of the old feud, but because he enjoyed the power it gave him. And Frederick, my dear Frederick, tried so hard to stop him. Even as a boy of 15, he argued against it. And when his father died 8 years ago, the first thing Frederick did was try to return the lands to your family secretly, only to have your proud father refuse any assistance from a Ravenscroft, even anonymous gifts that would have eased your burdens considerably. The music-hall at Lord Hastings's Grand Mayfair residence hummed with the sounds of a string quartet and polite conversation on that April evening as Eleanor entered the crowded salon. Her mind still reeling from the Dowager's revelations 2 days prior, the weight of newly understood truths pressing against her chest, while she searched the room for one particular face among the sea of jewels and evening dress, knowing Frederick would be here somewhere, and that she could no longer avoid the confrontation her conscience demanded. She spotted him near the pianoforte where Lady Pemberton's daughter attempted a Mozart sonata with more enthusiasm than skill, his tall frame rigid with that familiar cold control, while Lady Sophia Montague clung to his arm in her signature red gown. Her possessive fingers curled around his sleeve like crimson claws as she whispered something that made him frown. Though when his blue eyes suddenly found Eleanor across the room, something electric passed between them that made Lady Sophia's grip tighten visibly. Eleanor forced herself to approach, her heart hammering as she navigated through clusters of gossiping matrons who fell silent at her passing, their whispers following in her wake, about the presumptuous Ashford girl who dared pursue a duke, though Eleanor barely heard them over the roaring in her ears as she drew closer to Frederick, watching how his expression shifted from surprise to something more vulnerable when he realized her intent, gently but firmly extricating himself from Lady Sophia's grasp to meet Eleanor halfway, despite the beauty's obvious displeasure. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice carefully neutral, though she caught the question in his eyes, the uncertainty that seemed so at odds with his reputation for icy control, and Eleanor knew this was her moment to either retreat into safe silence or speak the truth that burned in her throat since leaving his grandmother's sitting room. "Your Grace, I wonder if we might speak privately," Eleanor heard herself say with a steadiness that surprised her, ignoring Lady Sophia's sharp intake of breath, and the way nearby conversations ceased entirely to focus on this unprecedented scene. And when Frederick nodded and gestured toward the less crowded conservatory adjoining the music room, Eleanor followed, despite every eye tracking their movement with avid curiosity. The conservatory's glass walls muffled the music, while orchids and ferns created an intimate jungle around them, the air heavy with moisture and the scent of earth, as Frederick turned to face her. His handsome features tight with what she now recognized as apprehension rather than coldness, and Eleanor found herself studying him with new eyes, seeing not the enemy duke, but the boy who had argued with his father at 15, who had tried to secretly restore what his family had taken, who carried guilt that wasn't truly his to bear. "I spoke with your grandmother," Eleanor said simply, watching his face transform from guarded curiosity to stunned understanding, his jaw tightening as he processed the implications while she continued with growing courage. "She told me about the real history between our families, about your father's cruelty and your attempts to make amends, about the anonymous gifts my father refused, about everything you tried to do to right wrongs that were never yours to fix. And I find myself wondering why you never told me yourself during our encounters at the museum or in that garden after our waltz." Frederick turned away from her toward the rain-spotted glass, his reflection wavering like a ghost as his voice emerged rough with long-suppressed emotion. "What would you have had me say, Miss Ashford, that my father took pleasure in destroying yours, that I watched it happen and could do nothing to stop it, that every attempt I made to restore your family's fortunes was thrown back in my face by your father's pride, That I dance with you knowing I represent everything your family has lost, and yet cannot stay away because you are the first person in years to look at me and see something beyond the title and the reputation." The raw honesty in his words made Eleanor's eyes fill with tears she refused to let fall, understanding now the weight he carried, the guilt that shaped his cold facade. And she moved closer despite propriety, despite the shocked faces she could see through the glass doors watching their tense exchange, reaching out to touch his sleeve with trembling fingers as she whispered, "I see you now, Frederick. Truly see you. And what I see is not my enemy, but a man who has spent years trying to atone for sins that were never his, who has hidden his true nature behind walls of ice because warmth was interpreted as weakness, who chose to dance with me that night, not from cruelty, but from recognition of a kindred spirit trapped by circumstances beyond our control." He turned at her touch, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that stole her breath as he covered her hand with his own, the warmth of his palm sending shivers through her entire being while he spoke with quiet fervor. "Eleanor, you cannot know what it means to hear you say that, to have someone see past the surface to the man beneath. But you must understand that my family's sins are real regardless of my intentions, that your father's hatred is justified even if misdirected, that being with me means facing not just gossip, but the very real pain our families have inflicted on each other." But before Eleanor could respond, before she could tell him that she had already chosen, that understanding had transformed resentment into something far more dangerous to her heart, the conservatory doors burst open as Lady Sophia appeared in a swirl of red silk and barely contained fury, her beautiful features twisted with rage as she hissed, "How dare you attempt to seduce him with your sob stories and calculated innocence? Everyone knows exactly what you are, Miss Ashford, a desperate nobody grasping for a title you could never deserve." And the moment shattered like glass, leaving Eleanor frozen while Frederick's expression hardened into something truly frightening as he stepped between them, his voice dropping to a tone that made even Lady Sophia step back, as he said with lethal quiet, "You will apologize to Miss Ashford immediately, Lady Sophia, or you will find that the Ravenscroft name you so desperately wish to claim will be forever beyond your reach." And in that moment, with Frederick defending her honor and Lady Sophia's face draining of color, Eleanor understood that whatever happened next, there was no returning to the careful dance of pretense and possibility. That truth once spoken demanded action, demanded choices that would reshape both their futures in ways neither could fully predict. The late evening of April 25th found Eleanor alone in Harriet's elegant drawing room, the house quiet, save for the distant sounds of servants preparing for bed, while she sat at the pianoforte that had become her refuge during these tumultuous weeks in London, her fingers hovering over the ivory keys as she wrestled with emotions too complex for words, yet demanding expression through the only medium that had never betrayed her. The candles burned low in their sconces, casting dancing shadows across the sheet music. She had no need to read, for this piece lived in her very bones. A melancholy sonata she had composed herself during those long years of isolation in the country, when music was her only companion, her only voice in a world that had forgotten the Ashfords existed. She began to play, softly at first, letting the notes spill into the darkness like secrets too dangerous for daylight. Each phrase a confession of longing she dared not speak aloud. For how could she admit even to herself that Frederick Ravenscroft had awakened something in her that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, that his defense of her at the musicale had shattered the last of her carefully constructed walls? The melody swelled under her fingers, growing bolder as she lost herself in the music, unaware that the garden door stood slightly ajar in the warm spring night, or that a tall figure had paused on the street outside, drawn by the haunting sound that drifted through the evening air like a siren's call. Frederick had been walking aimlessly through Mayfair, unable to sleep or concentrate since that confrontation with Eleanor. 5 days ago, when she had looked at him with eyes full of understanding rather than accusation, her touch on his sleeve still burning in his memory as he tried to reconcile the enemy's daughter with the woman who saw through his carefully constructed facade to the man beneath. The music pulled him forward, through the garden gate he found unlocked, across the small courtyard where jasmine bloomed in profusion, until he stood transfixed in the doorway, watching Eleanor play with an abandonment that stole his breath, her plain features transformed by passion into something transcendent, something that made his chest constrict with an emotion he dared not name. She played as if her very soul poured through her fingertips, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, completely lost in a world of her own creation, and Frederick understood with sudden, devastating clarity that he was witnessing the true Eleanor Ashford, not the quiet wallflower society dismissed, nor the proud woman who challenged him at every turn, but the artist whose depths he had only glimpsed until this moment. The sonata reached its crescendo, a cascade of notes that spoke of yearning and loss and hope all tangled together, and when the final chord faded into silence, Eleanor's shoulders sagged, as if she had given everything she had to the music, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the keys, while Frederick stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to break this spell that had revealed more truth than 1,000 conversations could convey. She must have sensed his presence somehow, for she turned slowly on the bench, her grey eyes widening when she found him watching from the doorway, and the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities, as neither moved, neither spoke, the moment stretching taut as a violin string, while Frederick's gaze travelled over her face, seeing her truly for perhaps the first time, not as an Ashford or an enemy, or even as the woman who had challenged everything he thought he knew about himself, but simply as Eleanor, whose music had called to something deep within him that he had thought long dead. And he took one step forward, then another, drawn by a force stronger than propriety or sense, while she remained perfectly still, watching him approach with those remarkable eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul, until he stood before her, close enough to see the rapid rise and fall of her breath, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to cling to her hair, close enough that when he reached out to trace the curve of her cheek with trembling fingers, she leaned into his touch with a soft sigh that nearly undid him completely. And in that moment, with her music still hanging in the air between them like an invisible thread binding their hearts together, Frederick knew with absolute certainty that he would give up everything, his title, his wealth, his very name if necessary, just to keep looking at her like this, just to be the man who understood the language of her music. But before he could close the distance between them, before his lips could find hers in the kiss that seemed as inevitable as sunrise, the sound of footsteps on the stairs shattered the moment like glass, and Harriet's voice calling out to ask if Eleanor needed anything sent them springing apart. The spell broken, but its magic lingering in the charged air between them as Frederick stepped back into the shadows, while Eleanor turned to face her approaching friend, with cheeks flushed and eyes bright with unshed tears, both of them knowing that something fundamental had shifted in that room, that the music had spoken truths their words had not yet found the courage to express. The morning of April the 28th dawned grey and damp in London, matching Eleanor's mood as she sat at Harriet's breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, while her friend read aloud from the latest gossip column with a voice that grew increasingly strained with each damning word. It has come to this author's attention that a certain impoverished Miss A, whose family's disgrace is well known to society, has set her calculating sights upon the Duke of T, employing every desperate stratagem at her disposal, including midnight assignations and unseemly displays of her modest talents to ensnare a man whose station so far exceeds her own as to make the pursuit not merely ambitious, but laughably pathetic. And Eleanor felt each word like a physical blow, her cheeks burning with humiliation as Harriet continued reading the poisonous prose that painted her as a fortune hunter of the worst sort, complete with exaggerated accounts of her throwing herself at Frederick and haunting his very footsteps like a spectre of misfortune, until finally Eleanor could bear no more and fled from the table to her room, where she began pulling gowns from the wardrobe with shaking hands. Knowing that Lady Sophia's hand was behind every cruel insinuation and that remaining in London would only bring more shame upon both herself and Frederick, whose reputation was now being questioned for his inexplicable fascination with such an unworthy creature. Harriet found her 20 minutes later surrounded by half-packed trunks, tears streaming down her face as she folded the silver gown that had started everything. And when her friend tried to argue that running away would only confirm the gossip's worst assumptions, Eleanor shook her head firmly, saying through her tears, "I will not be the instrument of his ruin, Harriet, not when he has shown me nothing but kindness, not when I know the weight he already carries for his family's sins against mine." But even as she spoke the words that should have been noble and self-sacrificing, her heart shattered at the thought of never seeing Frederick again, of returning to her father's house with this brief taste of what might have been forever tormenting her dreams. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones drew both women to the window where Frederick's distinctive black carriage had pulled up before the house, and Eleanor's pulse quickened with panic as she realized he must have seen the gossip column too, must be coming to formally end whatever understanding had grown between them, to salvage what remained of his reputation before Lady Sophia and her poisonous allies destroyed it entirely. And she turned from the window, unable to watch him approach, unable to bear seeing disgust or regret in those blue eyes that had looked at her with such intensity just 3 nights ago when her music had called him from the street. But when Frederick burst through her bedroom door without ceremony, Harriet having wisely withdrawn, his face was not cold with rejection, but blazing with a fury Eleanor had never seen before, his voice rough with barely controlled rage as he demanded, "You were leaving without a word, without giving me the chance to respond to this filth, without letting me show you and all of society exactly what I think of their whispers and judgments." And before Eleanor could form a response, he had crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her tear-stained face between his hands with a gentleness that belied his anger as he continued, "Eleanor Ashford, if you think I would let their poison drive you away, if you believe for one moment that I value their opinion over what I know to be true about your character, then you have not been paying attention to who I really am beneath this title they revere." And his thumbs brushed away her tears as he made his declaration not in a whisper, but in a voice that surely carried to the street below. "I intend to court you properly, publicly, with every honor and attention that should have been yours from the beginning, and let any who dare whisper about it face me directly, for I will not hide what I feel, not any more, not when I have found in you what I never thought to find in this lifetime." And Eleanor's knees nearly buckled at the fierce protectiveness in his voice, at the complete disregard for consequence that this man who had lived his entire life bound by duty and reputation was showing for her sake. And when she whispered brokenly that she was not worth such sacrifice, he silenced her with a look of such intensity that her words died in her throat as he said, "You are worth kingdoms, Eleanor, and I would burn every last one to the ground before I let their cruelty dim the light I see in you." And in that moment, with her packed trunks surrounding them and the echo of society's condemnation still ringing in her ears, Eleanor understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning, that Frederick Ravenscroft was choosing her not despite the scandal but in defiance of it, and when he formally asked if she would accept his official courtship, knowing full well what battles they would face, she could only nod through her tears, her heart too full for words as he pulled her into his arms and held her while she wept, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming realization that she was loved, truly loved, by a man who would face down all of society rather than let her believe herself unworthy of his devotion. The morning of April 29th dawned clear and bright over London, a fitting backdrop for Frederick's first public declaration of his courtship as his gleaming black carriage drew up before Harriet's townhouse at precisely 10 o'clock. The Duke of Thornhill himself, alighting with an enormous bouquet of red roses that drew gasps from passing pedestrians who had never seen the notoriously cold Duke carrying flowers like a lovesick youth. And when Eleanor answered the door herself, still in shock that he truly meant to court her before all of society, the tender way he presented the roses while murmuring, "Good morning, my dear Miss Ashford," loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, sent whispers racing through Mayfair faster than wildfire. Their first official outing was a drive through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour, Frederick's matched greys drawing admiring glances, while Eleanor sat beside him in her best afternoon dress, trying not to fidget under the weight of so many stares, some curious, some scandalized, some openly hostile. But Frederick seemed utterly unconcerned with society's reaction, keeping up a steady stream of conversation about books and music and art that gradually eased her nerves, his hand occasionally brushing hers on the carriage seat in a way that sent shivers through her entire being. When they encountered Lady Sophia near the Serpentine, resplendent in emerald silk and accompanied by her usual coterie of admirers, Frederick's greeting was coolly polite but distant, his attention never wavering from Eleanor, even when Lady Sophia attempted to engage him in conversation about a forthcoming ball, and the message was clear to all who witnessed it. The Duke of Thornhill had made his choice, and no amount of batting eyelashes or coy remarks would sway him from the woman at his side. Day after day, the pattern continued. Frederick appearing each morning with roses, escorting Eleanor to exhibitions and concerts and garden parties, always attentive, always protective, his hand at her elbow, guiding her through crowds that parted before them with expressions ranging from shock to calculation. As society began to realize this was no passing fancy, but a serious courtship that defied every expectation and social convention they held dear. Lord George Sinclair, watching his friend transform from distant duke to devoted suitor, remarked one evening at White's that he had never seen Frederick so animated, so genuinely happy, and gradually others began to notice, too, how the Duke's famous coldness melted whenever he looked at Miss Ashford, how his rare smiles came readily in her presence, how he listened to her opinions with genuine interest rather than the polite boredom he usually displayed in social settings. Eleanor herself bloomed under Frederick's unwavering attention, her confidence growing with each passing day as he continued to show the world that she was worthy of respect and admiration, introducing her to influential members of society with evident pride, defending her against the slightest slight with a protective fierceness that made even the boldest gossips think twice before spreading their poison, and slowly, inexorably, the tide of opinion began to turn. On May the 5th, when they attended the opera together, Eleanor wearing a new gown of deep blue silk that Frederick had insisted on commissioning for her, despite her protests about accepting such gifts, she felt the shift in how people looked at her, no longer with pity or scorn, but with a grudging curiosity, even respect, for any woman who could capture and hold the attention of the Duke of Thornhill must possess qualities beyond the immediately apparent. Frederick seemed to sense her growing comfort, becoming bolder in his displays of affection, holding her hand during the opera's most romantic arias, whispering translations of the Italian in her ear with his breath warm against her skin, and when tears slipped down her cheeks during the tragic finale, he offered his handkerchief without hesitation, his fingers lingering against hers as she accepted it, the gesture so tender and intimate that Lady Jersey herself was heard to remark that perhaps there was more to the Ashford girl than met the eye. But it was on May 8th, during an afternoon picnic in Richmond, that Lady Sophia had also attended with her set, that Eleanor finally began to truly believe in the miracle unfolding before her, for when Lady Sophia accidentally spilled lemonade on Eleanor's dress with a false cry of dismay, Frederick immediately removed his own coat to cover the stain, then proceeded to escort Eleanor to his carriage, announcing to the entire gathering that Miss Ashford's comfort was more important than any social occasion, and as they drove away, leaving Lady Sophia standing open-mouthed on the lawn, he took Eleanor's hand fully in his and said quietly but firmly, "You must know by now that nothing and no one will drive me away, that each day I fall more deeply under your spell, not through any witchcraft as they claim, but through the simple magic of discovering who you truly are beneath the facade society forced you to wear." And Eleanor found herself believing him at last, her heart soaring with a hope she had never dared embrace as she squeezed his hand in return, understanding dawning that this magnificent, complicated man truly saw her, valued her, cherished her for exactly who she was, and that perhaps, just perhaps, she was worthy of such devotion after all. The midday sun of May 12th cast long shadows through the dusty windows of Ashford House as Frederick's carriage rolled up the neglected drive, past overgrown hedges and crumbling stone walls that spoke eloquently of the family's reduced circumstances, and Eleanor, who had travelled ahead to prepare her father for this meeting, watched from an upstairs window with her heart in her throat, knowing that everything hinged on the next hour, on whether two proud men could set aside generations of hatred for the sake of love. Baron Thomas Ashford sat propped against pillows in his study, his once robust frame wasted by illness and bitterness, his grey eyes sharp with suspicion as the door opened to admit the Duke of Thornhill, and the tension in the room was palpable as Frederick entered. Removing his hat with careful deliberation, his usual commanding presence tempered by genuine humility as he faced the man whose family his own had destroyed. "Your Grace," the Baron said coldly, the title dripping with decades of resentment, "I cannot imagine what brings a Ravenscroft to darken my doorway after all these years, unless you have come to gloat over what remains of our ruin." But Frederick stood his ground, his voice steady and respectful as he replied, "I have come, Lord Ashford, to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage, to seek your blessing on a union I know must seem like the cruelest of jests given our family's history." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the Baron's harsh laugh that turned into a coughing fit, and when he recovered, his face was flushed with fury as he spat, "My blessing. You dare ask for my blessing to take the only good thing left in my life, to claim my Eleanor as another trophy in your family's collection of Ashford possessions?" And Frederick moved closer, surprising both Eleanor, listening from the hallway, and her father by dropping to one knee beside the Baron's chair, a gesture of supplication no duke should make to a ruined baron. "I ask not as a duke to a baron, not as a Ravenscroft to an Ashford, but as a man who loves your daughter with every fibre of his being, who would spend the rest of his life trying to undo the wrongs my family has inflicted upon yours," Frederick said quietly, reaching into his coat to withdraw a leather portfolio that he placed gently on the side table. "And perhaps these documents will help you understand that I began that process long before I ever met Eleanor. That for the past 5 years I have been quietly purchasing and restoring every piece of Ashford land my father stole, waiting for the right moment to return them without it seeming like charity or condescension. The Baron's hands trembled as he opened the portfolio, his eyes widening as he recognized deed after deed, all transferred back to the Ashford name, all legally binding and complete, representing a fortune in property that would restore the family's security and standing. And Frederick continued softly, "I could not undo my father's cruelty, could not restore your father's life or the years of suffering, but I could at least return what was stolen. And I swear to you now that Eleanor knew nothing of this until this moment. That she has won my heart, not through gratitude or obligation, but through her own extraordinary worth that shines despite every attempt the world has made to dim it." Eleanor could not help herself then, bursting through the door with tears streaming down her face as she flew to her father's side, taking his shaking hand in hers as she looked between the two men who meant everything to her, and the Baron's stern facade finally cracked as he saw the truth written plainly on his daughter's face, the love that transcended their bitter history, the happiness that bloomed in her presence like flowers after a long winter. "You love him," the Baron said wonderingly, as if seeing his daughter clearly for the first time in years. "Truly love him, not for his title or wealth, but for himself." And when Eleanor nodded, unable to speak through her tears, her father turned back to Frederick with a look that held pain and hope in equal measure, saying slowly, "Then perhaps it is time for this feud to end, for hatred has brought nothing but misery to both our houses, and if my daughter can find happiness with you, then I will not let my pride stand in her way." And with those words, he extended his hand to Frederick, who took it with reverence, the handshake sealing not just a betrothal, but the end of a vendetta that had poisoned two families for far too long, while Eleanor wept with joy, understanding that love had indeed conquered all. The evening of May 15th found all of London's elite gathered at the Pemberton mansion for what society deemed the event of the season. A grand ball where the official announcement of the Duke of Thornhill's engagement to Miss Eleanor Ashford would finally put to rest the endless speculation and gossip that had consumed the Tun for weeks. And Eleanor stood before her mirror in Harriet's dressing room, her hands trembling as her friend fastened a magnificent diamond necklace around her throat, a betrothal gift from Frederick that caught the light like captured stars, transforming her from overlooked spinster to future duchess before her own wondering eyes. The silver gown had been replaced by one of deep midnight blue that brought out hidden depths in her grey eyes, the finest silk that whispered with every movement, cut in the latest fashion to emphasize her graceful figure that society had dismissed as too thin, too unremarkable. And as Harriet stepped back with tears of joy glistening on her cheeks, she declared, "My dear Eleanor, you are radiant, absolutely radiant, and when Frederick sees you tonight, he will fall in love with you all over again." Though Eleanor could hardly believe this fairy tale was real, that in mere moments she would stand before hundreds of people who had whispered cruel things about her and claim her place at Frederick's side. The Pemberton ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, the cream of society assembled in their finest jewels and silks, the air thick with anticipation and the competing scents of hothouse flowers and expensive perfume. And when the major domo announced, "His Grace the Duke of Thornhill and Miss Eleanor Ashford," a hush fell over the crowd as Frederick led her down the grand staircase, his hand warm and steady on hers, his eyes holding such open adoration that even the most cynical gossips found themselves dabbing at their eyes. They moved through the crowd like a ship parting waves, accepting congratulations with gracious smiles, and Eleanor marveled at how different it felt to be the center of attention when she had someone beside her who valued her, protected her, made her feel worthy of every honor being bestowed. And when they reached the center of the ballroom where Lord and Lady Pemberton waited to formally congratulate them, Frederick raised his voice to address the entire assembly, his words clear and carrying to every corner of the vast room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you tonight the most fortunate of men, for Miss Eleanor Ashford has done me the extraordinary honor of agreeing to become my wife. And I wanted you all to witness my public declaration that she is not merely my chosen bride, but my heart's true companion, my intellectual equal, my soul's perfect match, and any who would speak against her, speak against me," his voice ringing with such fierce conviction that Lady Sophia, standing near the refreshment table in a gown of virulent green that matched her envious expression, actually flinched as if struck, while around them the crowd burst into applause, some genuine, some calculated, but all acknowledging that the Duke of Thornhill had made his position absolutely clear. The orchestra struck up the first waltz as Frederick led Eleanor onto the dance floor, the same waltz that had started everything 2 months ago, but now as his hand found her waist and she placed her gloved hand in his, there was no hesitation, no fear. Only the perfect synchronization of two souls who had found their match against all odds, and around them the cream of society watched with expressions ranging from genuine delight to barely concealed envy as the Duke of Thornhill gazed at his betrothed with such naked adoration that even the most hardened cynics felt their hearts soften. "Do you remember, my darling?" Frederick murmured as they moved together in perfect harmony. "How you fled from me that first night, how you ran to the garden as if I were the devil himself pursuing you." And Eleanor laughed, a sound like silver bells that drew smiles from those near enough to hear it, replying, "I remember thinking you were mocking me, that the great Duke of Thornhill had chosen the poor Ashford girl as the evening's entertainment, never dreaming that you were as affected as I was, that your heart was racing as wildly as mine." And he spun her expertly, her midnight blue gown billowing around her like water, before drawing her close again to whisper, "I knew from that first touch, that first moment our eyes met across the ballroom, that you would be my undoing and my salvation, though it took me far too long to understand that being undone by you would be the making of me." The Dowager Duchess watched from her position of honor near the orchestra, a satisfied smile playing about her lips as she observed her grandson's complete transformation, remembering the cold, controlled man he had been before Eleanor Ashford had waltzed into his life and thawed the ice around his heart. And beside her, Lord George Sinclair raised his champagne glass in a silent toast to the friend who had finally found the courage to choose love over duty, happiness over reputation, while across the room Lady Sophia Montague stood frozen in her green gown, her beautiful face a mask of disbelief as she watched the man she had considered her property dance with the woman she had dismissed as beneath notice. As the waltz drew to a close, Frederick did something that sent a collective gasp through the ballroom, bending to press a kiss to Eleanor's gloved hand, and then, in defiance of all propriety, turning her hand to press his lips to the delicate skin of her wrist, where her pulse fluttered like a captured bird, his eyes never leaving hers as he straightened and declared loud enough for all to hear, "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the future Duchess of Thornhill, the woman who has taught me that true nobility lies not in ancient bloodlines or accumulated wealth, but in the courage to love without reservation, to see beyond the surface to the gold that lies beneath. And I count myself the most fortunate of men that she has chosen to entrust her heart to my keeping." And as Eleanor's eyes filled with happy tears, the ballroom erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very crystals in the chandeliers above, a sound that marked not just the celebration of an engagement, but the final defeat of prejudice and the triumph of love over every obstacle society had tried to place in its path. The wedding of the Duke of Thornhill to Miss Eleanor Ashford took place on a glorious morning in late June at the ancient Thornhill family chapel, where generations of Ravenscrofts had pledged their vows beneath soaring Gothic arches. But never before had the sacred space witnessed such a transformation of joy as when Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, the Baron having recovered enough strength to give his daughter away to the man who had not only won her heart, but restored their family's honor. The chapel overflowed with the cream of society, including those who had whispered cruelly about Eleanor just months before, now forced to witness her elevation to one of the highest positions in the land. And as sunlight streamed through stained-glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across her ivory silk gown, embroidered with seed pearls and silver thread, even Lady Sophia Montague could not deny that the bride possessed a radiance that transcended conventional beauty. Frederick stood at the altar in his finest mourning coat, his usually controlled features softened by an expression of such tender anticipation that Lord George Sinclair, standing as his groomsman, had to clear his throat to hide his own emotion at seeing his friend so utterly transformed by love, while beside Eleanor, Harriet Beaumont served as matron of honor, tears of joy sliding down her cheeks as she remembered the frightened, resigned woman who had arrived at her doorstep just 3 months prior. The Archbishop intoned the sacred words that would bind 2 feuding families together for all time. And when Frederick spoke his vows, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the chapel, promising to love, cherish, and honor Eleanor above all others, above all worldly considerations, above even his own life, several hardened society matrons found themselves reaching for their handkerchiefs, moved by the raw sincerity in every word. Eleanor's own vows, spoken in a clear, steady voice that bore no trace of the timid wallflower she had once been, included a promise to stand beside Frederick, not just as his Duchess, but as his partner, his equal, his heart's true companion through whatever trials or triumphs lay ahead. And when the Archbishop pronounced them man and wife, Frederick broke with all propriety by cupping Eleanor's face in his hands and kissing her with such passionate devotion that gasps echoed through the chapel, followed by spontaneous applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient building. The wedding breakfast at Thornhill House surpassed anything society had seen, with the Dowager Duchess presiding over festivities that celebrated not just a marriage, but the healing of old wounds, the mending of a feud that had poisoned 2 families for generations. And as Frederick led Eleanor in their first dance as husband and wife, the same waltz that had started their incredible journey, he whispered against her ear, "My darling Duchess, my heart's own music, you have given me more than a wife, more than love. You have given me redemption, purpose, and a future bright with promise." To which Eleanor replied with shining eyes, "And you, my dearest Frederick, have given me the courage to be myself." The years that followed the wedding unfolded like the pages of a fairy tale that Eleanor had never dared to dream for herself, bringing with them joys so profound that she sometimes woke in the night simply to watch Frederick sleeping beside her, still marveling that this man who had once been her enemy by birth had become her heart's true home. And their first child arrived on a snowy January morning, a daughter with her father's dark hair and her mother's grey eyes, whom they named Agnes, after the Dowager Duchess who wept with joy upon holding her great-granddaughter for the first time, declaring that the child carried the best of both families in her tiny form and would grow to be a woman of remarkable strength and grace. The Thornhill estate transformed under Eleanor's gentle influence from a monument to cold aristocratic pride into a warm and welcoming home filled with music and laughter. For Frederick had commissioned the finest piano in all of England to be installed in the morning room where Eleanor played every day, her gift no longer hidden but celebrated. And soon their daughter joined her at the bench, small fingers picking out melodies, while Frederick stood in the doorway, watching his two greatest treasures with an expression of such tender devotion that the servants whispered among themselves about how the fearsome Duke had been utterly conquered by love. Baron Thomas Ashford lived to see his daughter's happiness bloom, his health mysteriously improving once the burden of hatred and debt had been lifted from his shoulders, and he spent his final years in a comfortable cottage on the Thornhill estate, where Eleanor visited him daily, their relationship healed by Frederick's quiet generosity and the passage of time that softened old wounds into distant memories. And when he passed peacefully in his sleep, it was with Eleanor's hand in his, and Frederick standing guard at the door, the two men having forged an unlikely bond built on their shared love for the woman who had bridged the chasm between their families. Harriet Beaumont remained Eleanor's dearest friend. Her emerald necklace eventually passed to little Agnes as a christening gift, a symbol of the friendship that had given Eleanor the courage to step into the ballroom that fateful night. And Lord George Sinclair finally found his own happiness with a spirited young widow who matched his wit, their wedding taking place at Thornhill Chapel, with Frederick serving as groomsman and Eleanor playing the processional on the chapel organ. Society eventually forgot that it had ever doubted the match, that it had whispered cruel words about the plain Miss Ashford, who had somehow captured the most eligible duke in England, for Eleanor's quiet dignity and genuine kindness won over even her harshest critics, and those who had once looked down upon her now sought her favor, though she received them all with the same grace, never forgetting the sting of their earlier rejection, but choosing compassion over bitterness, a choice that Frederick admired more than he could ever express, telling her often that she had taught him more about true nobility in their years together than all his ancestors combined had demonstrated in centuries of privilege and power. The story of the Duke and Duchess of Thornhill became one of those tales that London society told and retold across generations, passed down from mothers to daughters as proof that love could triumph over circumstances, that worth existed independent of wealth or beauty or the accidents of birth that determined so much of Regency life. And Eleanor herself became a figure of quiet legend, the plain spinster who had captured the heart of the most eligible bachelor in England, not through artifice or manipulation, but through the simple power of being genuinely herself, a lesson that many ambitious mammas tried and failed to teach their own daughters in the years that followed. The Thornhill estate flourished under their joint stewardship, Eleanor's practical intelligence complementing Frederick's business acumen, and together they expanded their charitable works to include a school for village children where music formed a central part of the curriculum, Eleanor herself teaching piano to any student who showed interest, believing with all her heart that every child deserved the chance to discover their own hidden gifts as she had discovered hers in that modest country house with its slightly out-of-tune instrument. A second child arrived, a son named Thomas for Eleanor's father, and then twin girls who inherited their mother's thoughtful grey eyes and their father's stubborn determination, and the nursery wing of Thornhill House rang with laughter and music and the particular chaos that only a houseful of beloved children could create, a sound that Frederick declared was the finest symphony he had ever heard, far surpassing any performance in the grandest concert halls of Europe. The Dowager Duchess Agnes lived to see all 4 great-grandchildren take their first steps, her sharp eyes softening whenever she watched Frederick with his family. This grandson, whom she had feared might never learn to love, transformed into a devoted husband and father. And when she passed peacefully in her 90th year, it was with Eleanor holding one hand and Frederick the other, both of them weeping for the woman who had set their love story in motion with a single afternoon tea and a truth that needed telling. Lady Sophia Montague eventually married a viscount and moved to the North Country, her influence in London society gradually fading until she became merely a cautionary tale about the perils of cruelty, while Lord George Sinclair and his wife became the Thornhills' closest companions, their children growing up together, playing in the same gardens where Frederick had once found Eleanor hiding from her own feelings. And on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the house settled into peaceful stillness, Eleanor would play piano while Frederick sat nearby reading, occasionally looking up to watch her fingers dance across the keys. Still amazed after all their years together that this remarkable woman had chosen him, had forgiven his family's sins, had transformed his cold and carefully ordered life into something rich with meaning and warmth and the kind of love he had never believed possible for a man who had once been called the enemy duke. If you are listening to this story and finding yourself in Eleanor's place at its beginning, if you know what it feels like to be overlooked and undervalued, to be dismissed by a world that judges worth by standards you can never meet, then let this tale be a lantern in your darkness, a whisper of hope when all seems lost. For the truth that Eleanor discovered in that season of 1815 is the same truth that waits for each of us if only we have the courage to believe it. That our worth is not determined by society's narrow definitions, not measured by beauty or wealth or the circumstances of our birth, but by the depth of our hearts and the strength of our spirits and the quiet dignity with which we face a world that so often fails to see us clearly. Eleanor was 26 when her story began, considered firmly on the shelf, plain-featured and poor, the daughter of a disgraced family with nothing to recommend her but a gift for music she was too afraid to share. And yet she became the woman a duke would burn kingdoms for, not because she changed herself to meet some impossible standard, but because she finally allowed herself to be seen, to step out of the shadows where she had hidden for so long, and trust that someone might recognize her true value. The waltz that changed everything lasted only a few minutes, a single dance at a ball she never wanted to attend, but it opened a door she had believed forever closed. And the man who held out his hand to her that night became her partner, not just in that dance, but in all the dances that followed, in the grand waltz of life itself, with its moments of joy and sorrow, its turns both expected and surprising. So if you find yourself tonight feeling invisible, feeling as though your best years have passed you by and hope is a luxury you can no longer afford, remember Eleanor standing in her worn blue dress before her father's piano. Remember her walking into enemy territory in a silver gown with nothing but her mother's grey gloves to armor her against a hostile world. Remember her choosing courage over comfort, love over fear, possibility over the safe prison of resignation. Your waltz is waiting, perhaps not with a duke in a candlelit ballroom, but with whatever form your heart's desire takes. And the only question that matters is whether you will have the courage to step onto the floor when the music begins. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Eleanor and Frederick's story. And if it has touched your heart, if it has given you even a moment of hope or escape, or the sweet pleasure of a love story well told, then I invite you to subscribe and return for more tales of overlooked souls finding their way to happiness. For in a world that can be so harsh, we all deserve stories that remind us love is possible, transformation is real, and it is never too late to begin again.